help us understand this a little bit. With a high conviction rate like this, with such a rarity that someone actually gets out on bail, what does all of this mean?
Well, it is unusual that he got out on bail before trial, especially as he didn't confess. As you rightly point out, in Japan, prosecutors work their hardest to get confessions, and part of the reason why they detain suspects for so long is basically in the hopes of breaking them down so that they will make a confession. And in this case, Carlos Ghosn did not do that. As you said, he's protesting his innocence quite vociferously. And so it's very rare. Usually the rate of someone getting out on bail having not confessed is about 1 in 13. So he's kind of a rare case. And analysts are sort of saying in Tokyo that part of the reason may well have been that in the 108 days that he spent behind bars in Tokyo, Japan came under quite a considerable international scrutiny for its criminal justice system. He was questioned by interrogators without being allowed to have his lawyer present. He was kept in detention, not allowed to see his family until he was indicted. He's been indicted on 2 separate cases. So I think it may well have been the international pressure that led to his release.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot like this. I'm not sure if you know this, but we've talked about that high conviction rate of 99.9%. How high is the conviction rate once you actually go to trial, if most of these are actually pled out or people will sign a confession beforehand?
Well, I think those conviction rate, that 99% conviction rate is based on trial. So the defendants will be put on trial, but there'll be a confession. The prosecutors and former prosecutors that we've spoken to said that it's not just a confession that leads to the conviction. There has to be other supporting evidence. And part of the reason that the prosecutors would have kept Mr. Ghosn or any other defendant in detention as long as they do is to allow them to build a case, to ask as many questions as possible, to gather documentation. And during this whole time that he's been incarcerated, he has had no access to anybody who might have been able to help him build a case. His lawyers have not been able to do the kind of discovery that, say, American lawyers would have been doing during this period.
How does it work? Is this a jury of his peers who would be hearing this? Is this a judge who makes this decision?
Predominantly, these cases will go just before a judge. There are some rare cases, I believe, that go before juries, but generally speaking, they're judges or a panel of judges. But he has a new lawyer now who has a reputation for getting acquittals for his clients. So this guy is known in Japan as the Razor. For his sharp wit, I suppose, and his ability to get his clients off. So for the first nearly 3 months, Mr. Ghosn had a different legal team, and then they were excused, and he hired this new lawyer, Mr. Hironaka, who has a reputation for gaining acquittals in very high-stakes cases.
Motoko, I know that this is also just us kind of speculating from here, but if it's the international pressure that we all think probably led to him being allowed to be out on bail, is there any reason to think that that would also put pressure on what a judge might decide, or is this just kind of the show before international pressure is not going to be working in a courtroom past that?
Right, that's a really good question. I mean, generally speaking, when I've talked to former judges, I haven't been able to get to current judges, but former judges have said, some of them have complained that the judicial system is too political in Japan, that they feel that there is pressure to bring convictions. But others have talked to me about how when it comes right down to it, the judiciary may be very bureaucratic, they may take a long time to make these cases, but they are independent-minded. So it's not clear whether the international pressure will actually affect the verdict. I mean, there is a case, the prosecutors believe they have a case. Up until the very last minute, they were still trying to keep Mr. Ghosn incarcerated up until yesterday. When the court approved his release on bail, the prosecutors appealed that, and then late last night, they were denied that appeal, and so then he was allowed to come out today. It was a little bit of drama because, as you said, his bail was set at a very high rate of 1 billion yen, which is about $9 million, and he had to offer that bail in cash. So it took a bit of time to get the cash together to pay it, and then after we had heard that the bail had been paid, we were still waiting and waiting and waiting for him to be released, and there was a huge scrum of media at the gates of the detention center, and he managed to sort of evade them a bit by coming out in disguise, wearing a mask, and looking like a kind of a construction worker or a crossing guard.
What's the biggest bill in Japan? I mean, if you've got, how many billion yen did you say he had to pay in cash?
1 billion.
So what's the
yen
largest
in cash.
bill? What are we talking about?
We were talking about that today. I personally have never seen a bill larger than 100,000 yen. And so we were talking about today. We're trying to do the math on how much. I can't remember off the top of my head what we came up with.
It doesn't fit in a briefcase,
there
right?
There was some talk of that. It was going to be very heavy just to carry this this cash around.
Motoko, you mentioned the political pressure in terms of convictions in Japan. How much of this is going to be making Carlos Ghosn an example to sort of say corporate greed here in Japan? It's not okay, and you will face the fullest punishment of the law.
Well, there's a lot of talk and speculation along that lines, and it's very cultural, the divide. I think if you talk to foreign expats here, they will say this was clearly an opportunity or an effort to kind of frame the foreigner. But there are many cases in which Japanese defendants have also undergone the similar treatment, where they've been incarcerated for many, many months, even longer than Carlos Ghosn was, with high. It's not the highest level of bail that's ever been set. So it's not totally clear how much this was about let's get the foreigner. In terms of your point about greed, culturally, in corporate culture in Japan, it's definitely not the case that CEOs would be asking for the kind of levels of pay that he was going after. And I think there's definitely been a sense here that he has been described as having been greedy here, that he wanted more than was typical in Japan. And he was certainly much higher paid than most CEOs in Japan.
What about the future for Nissan, for the partnership with Mitsubishi and Renault? How is that all working out in the meantime?
Right. Well, so that is basically in total chaos. I mean, if you talk to people who are interested in the rights of shareholders, they're very upset. This is the worst kind of possible situation for shareholders. Of course, the largest shareholder in Nissan is Renault, and there have been reports that part of the motivation, perhaps, for the Nissan management to have moved against Mr. Ghosn, or to have sort of disclosed some of these bad corporate governance practices on his part, are because of talk of a merger, rather than just having Renault own a large stake in Nissan. It sounded like Mr. Ghosn may have been cooperating with Renault to try to develop a merger between the two, which the Japanese side did not want. So there's a huge question about what's going to happen. He still technically remains on the board of all three of the companies, but he has been stripped of the chairmanship of all three companies. Nissan itself has to have a special shareholders meeting to vote Mr. Ghosn off the board. There was a question that we were talking about today about whether he is still, because he's on the board, is going to show up at a board meeting before the shareholders meeting to try to make some kind of motion or face his accusers. One of the conditions of his bail is that he's not supposed to be in touch with anybody connected with the case, so I don't know how that affects his ability to show up at a board meeting.